All right. I'm here with a very special guest who is an expert in, I think, some of the issues around generative AI licensing. My name is Noah Gift, and I've been doing this podcast for a bit. And I'm also an O'Reilly author. I've written, I think, 5 books for O'Reilly and have a pretty good understanding of the tech world. But I think it would be nice to have a different perspective about some of the very complex issues with generative AI. And you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So thanks for having me. Johan Brandstedt. I work in digital strategy and concept development at a Scandinavian consultancy. I've been in and out of tech for 20 years, and in between, I've been working in publishing and licensing. So kind of both navigating the world of creative content production and that sort of thing, and building data-driven businesses. And I think what's happening now is very much in the intersection of the two. And I find myself standing in sort of two sides of some of the battle lines in what's going on right now. So I'm trying to do my bit in educating and maybe getting people on the up to some basic level in terms of uh, licensing and property rights and the business side of what's going on right now as well.
Yeah, I think a big thing that technical people are often unaware of are the implications of the technology. I know I've been in the tech world for a while, and I teach students who are entering the tech world, and I think it's very seldom do you even talk about you know, you're gonna use some technology, what does that actually mean? How does it
Hmm.
affect society? It's very rare. But
Hmm.
this is a very, special one, I think, in that it would be interesting, I think, to many people to hear, like, why are people upset about what's happening? Because in my opinion, I think there's a very legitimate concern, and I think many people are just so enamored with, like, "Oh, look, a new thing, we can use this new technology." I don't think they really understand some of the concerns. I think that would be a great thing to set the stage with.
Yeah. So I guess let's start with the big news today, right? And one of the VPs of Stability AI resigned very publicly. So and citing like this, is a conscientious objector against the way that tech companies present what they want to do in terms of property rights and so on. So there was this huge request for comments process. The USCO, they got nearly 10,000 comments from everyone from big tech companies to individual artists and so on where should we go with AI and IP. And the range of uh, like comments in there is everything from people having suddenly become a creative voice using these new tools and thinking, wow, I made what came out of this system and I should have the moral rights and the commercial exploitation rights to it. That's one big voice. And there's rights holders who have been kind of hammering on the same point since the debates around text and data mining exceptions in back in 2018, 2019, saying there are serious market impacts from this technology. Like we see loss of income, we see loss of opportunity, and we see our own work and our own names being used against us in the marketplace using these technologies. So really calling for licensing and regulation. And then you have the big tech companies who basically use any excuse in the book to say that this is fair. We should be allowed to do whatever with content that we found on the internet, and they cite all sorts of reasons. And I think that so what this Stability AI VP, I forget his name now, he said, "Well, I can't stand for what Stability's official songbook says. According to the songbook, the computer learns like a person, so everything we do is fair use." And there's something called the four factors of fair use, and we've seen this kind of tested in court various times this year in the US. And one of the most important principles is how does this technology affect the market of the underlying work? And that's where it stops being fair to him. That's the one he pointed to. Like if we introduce music generation machines. This severely impacts the market for musicians. So it can't be fair use. And the reason for him speaking up was that he's also a classical composer, right? So he has that background and understanding for that side of thing, and knows what it takes to actually make it in that field, and what the sort of training and investment and passion that goes into producing music, and how that's being exploited by these companies. And what's interesting also is that Stability AI approached music actually quite cautiously from a rights and licensing point of view, compared to what they do to written material and to images. Because and that has a lot to do with the concentration of power within the music industry. So there's the big five of Universal Music and those who have quite mature licensing systems and quite a big say. And when you look at kind of the previous tech shift with the big platforms, Web 2.0, YouTube, and that sort of thing, a lot of those like user-generated content platform, they built in uh, copyright protection, IP protection by design from the get-go. Imperfectly, but still, it was a design consideration. And if you look at Spotify, that has very similar roots to some of these companies today. They started out basically taking MP3 pirate collections and using that as a business asset, putting that in a streaming service on the market, and then figuring out licensing. They went to these big five and they say, hey, we have this much better way of consuming and distributing music over here that saves a lot of money compared to shuffling plastic discs around. And they say, you get a piece of our business, to these five. And doing that kind of laid the groundwork, because all the smaller artists kind of just had to run with it, right? And that's similar to what we see also now. Like that, but the the big difference is they respected the rights of at least the big content players, right? They saw them as business partners and they took them in. The difference here is they just run with it. And there's been negotiations. Now OpenAI tried to find some negotiation deal, some licensing deal with the big newspapers and the big book publishers, and it kind of, they couldn't see eye to eye. So only after failing to find some business arrangement, they went to court, and now that whole thing is going on, right? So yeah, I guess Stability Guy, he came from a background of a mature licensing system around creative content, right? And a concentrated power around that licensed content. And if you look to publishing and if you look to art, it's much more dispersed. So the way to that Spotify then kind of started licensing from smaller artists is they said, we can't possibly find all these people. We don't know who to pay. We don't have it. We have this blob of content and get people to subscribe and pay a monthly fee. And they used class action lawsuits basically to find their suppliers. Through the courts, they found who wants to get paid when we do this, and then they sort of took it from there, and they reached some sort of licensing arrangement with all the smaller players within the music industry. So that's that's a little bit of background. Was
Yeah.
this very messy and rambling?
No,
Should
no.
we
I, th-
go
I
on?
think I think there's a very good like setup to some of the issues here. In that, if you look at, there's a study that was done. I think it was University of Pennsylvania. A couple of professors uh, created a publication called the Regulatory Entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
And inside of this publication, I think we've discussed this before offline, is that the premise is actually pretty straightforward in terms of the way the tech companies work, is that they actually find lucrative markets where there's actually laws, and people are abiding by those laws, and then they intentionally break the law, so they do illegal things, and then they are able to have an advantage over this
Mm.
over the really the competitors because they're playing by the rules, right? They're in the case of the taxi industry is a classic example of this,
Mhm.
that you had to buy in some cases a taxi medallion that could be maybe $1 million. So let's say
Mm.
you're an immigrant to the United States and you think that, hey, this is a good strategy, I can do follow the laws of the United States, and maybe even you're required to follow the laws. I don't know all of the logistics around, keeping your citizen status, but I believe there's some severe penalties if you, even do misdemeanors, etc. So you're an
Mhm.
immigrant, you're following the law, you put your life savings into it.
Mhm.
Even if you wanted to break the law and compete, you could get basically deported. And so there's these real issues with people losing quite a bit of money from the companies like Uber and Lyft because they came in and just didn't follow the law. And
Mm.
there's a lot of evidence about this, how they were able to, give false promises of, well, we're going to get self-driving cars and we're going to reduce pollution and we're going to pay people more money and we're going to have safer taxis.
Mm.
Turns out that the majority of what they said has been demonstra- demonstratively
Mm.
demonstratively proven incorrect, is
Yeah,
that
yeah.
none of those things actually happen. So this is
Mm.
really a pattern you see, and it's just repeated over and over again with venture capital tech companies. And in fact,
Mm.
the leader of this, which is interesting, has been Y Combinator. By any stretch of the imagination, is, I think, the most popular incubator. And
Mm.
the CEO, the first one was Paul Graham, a pretty famous person on Twitter, very famous libertarian as well. Of course, I've noticed a lot of libertarians have Harvard degrees, and we also, if we look at Harvard, we know that it's a pay to play system, right? Like there's actually quite a bit of evidence that extremely wealthy people
Mm.
go to the elite school. So, I guess it's easy to be a libertarian if you're born rich and you have the highest degree from the most elite, university in the world. It's easy to say, hey, there should be no rules, right? Um, but
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there are some. I mean, if we look at the paper regulatory entrepreneurship, it really captures exactly the playbook of how Y Combinator and similar, how they do things over and over. What's interesting, I think, about the paper, that it doesn't really take any moral stance about it. It says this is plain observation. This is how it goes, and they even go, I think, into some of the moral justifications, which I mean, there's some merit to it because they say, here's a technology that's so revolutionary it changes the game. Hence, normal rules don't apply. We need to figure out the rules as we go. So let's go ahead, move fast and break things and figure out uh, later. And that's I think what we keep seeing is the moving fast and breaking things. Eventually, the timeless principles and the rest of society catches up, right? And there's this ethos of like business is really fast and law is slow, and haha, look at the EU, they get bogged down in regulation, so they lose. That is sort of how it goes, right? The story. And the thing is like a legal system is very deliberately designed to be very slow moving, slow changing, to give thoughtful consideration to like what are the timeless principles here, like what is the calibrated balance between elements in society, right? We can't just go changing law on a whim because then nobody will know how to act on the market or in society at large, right? Um, and so when you look at the principles that kind of underpin intellectual property law, they're the same since 125 years, and they survived the talkies and the CD burners and the MP3 players and the streaming, and the principles are really simple, and they're kind of built into the founding documents of most nations. Like I think it's 193 nations agreed on a framework of, well, it's you have your right to life, liberty, and property, right? That's a basic very basic, and it's part of the constitution in the US and the EU Charter, and then you have the UN Charter of the Human Rights, which basically say that you can't kill, you can't enslave, you can't steal. That's basically what it says, right? And then the rest is kind of, there's a lot of interpretation, a lot of moving parts on top of it, but the basic idea is, if you made something, you own it, right? That's extremely basic. And if you want to make money off of someone else's property, you ask first and you compensate them. That's like super super simple. um, and so I think the play here is to kind of move so fast that people get a bit disoriented on what first of all, like what rights do I have? People don't go about thinking about their rights so much on a day-to-day basis, right? They don't go, what did the constitution say again about like and then it's a matter of figuring out this very complicated technology, and which the tech companies explain deliberately obtusely, or they kind of frame things in a way that suits their interests, and then everyone else has to go, what, hey, wait a minute, where did we go from somebody put my stuff on the internet to you get to use it against me on the market? Like what happened in between? Right? um, so yeah, and I think that's the catching up is happening, but it's really a race. And I think there's this idea within tech that you can sort of outrun your own exhausts in some way. Like if you get enough power to take off, you can just leave everything behind and go live on Mars or on your yacht or something, right? And the suckers get left behind. um yeah, so I think that's the
Yeah,
pattern you
yeah, it
see.
is. I think it's interesting because the same people are often at the center of this. So there's something in the tech world called the PayPal mafia, which
Mhm.
was the original founders of PayPal, Elon Musk, Reid Hoffman, Max, I think Levin, if that's how you pronounce him, and then maybe also there was Peter Thiel. I don't know if
Yeah,
I mentioned him, and so some of these people, they all preach very similar things, which is basically blitz scale, move, go fast, and what we're seeing though is that if you realistically look at the history of many of the great success stories in tech, I think you look at it in a hindsight and say, was this really that good? Like, for example, Airbnb is, I think, a very good one as well, where I've lived next to Airbnbs before where it's just a living hell. Like we were living in a very expensive property in the Bay Area, and next door it was an illegal Airbnb,
hmm,
and they had bikers come and peel out the driveway and all these strange things, and it's illegal. Like the zoning of the city says you cannot put a hotel in my neighborhood, right? It's not
yeah,
zoned for commercial use, right? it
right,
and
right.
and the platform doesn't care, right? Like, and so
No,
I think
that's right.
that's the thing,
Yeah,
is they get to play both sides, right? They get to create the profit from all of these things, but then if there's a negative externality,
yeah.
they just pretend it doesn't exist.
Right, right. It's a externality denying capitalism at its finest, and also it's about eroding the local tax base, right? If you look at Amazon in the EU, for instance, I think they make something like 50 billion per year and pay zero taxes in the EU, like buying and selling stuff and then not paying back basically, and that's yeah, it's a real issue, and they're very powerful companies. So, and I think a lot of it comes down to size and deregulation, like that. And so the antitrust action going on is under Biden is the first in many years where we don't like keep removing antitrust. We've the guy kind of gone as far as you can, I think. Now we're starting to see some action towards breaking up some of these behemoths, right? But it's going to be a long road, and they have a lot of influence and a lot of power in just like moving capital and people around uh, across national borders. So the power balance between nation states and large companies is a bit out of whack as well, I would say.
Yeah, I think if you look at some of there's very rare actually to have $1 billion companies that pay taxes, and one
Mm,
of the few is actually a company called Bet365. I was just listening
mm,
to a podcast, and you know, I'm not a fan of gambling. I think it's not great for society, but it's shocking when you find out that actually a company decides to stay somewhere and pay the taxes. So that's one of the one few examples is that it's in the UK that so it's so rare for a company to pay taxes that it's even something that you discuss. And the thing you mentioned as well about the consolidation of power. One of the things that happened in the Obama administration was that Facebook had the ability to buy Instagram and WhatsApp, and that, to be honest, was really a tragedy for the world. And we see that there's many instances of the tech company then making money off of spreading misinformation.
mm,
There's credible instances of you know genocide, right, that have occurred.
mm,
You know, I think they're still being researched, and these kinds of things really are much more possible when there's consolidation because you're
mm,
able to reach a global audience. But then again, the negative externality is that if you live in a country where a corporation like Meta is monetizing the traffic, but they don't yet have the human moderation.
yeah,
You're pushing the negative
yeah,
externality. So it feels like there's actually a very clear pattern amongst all tech companies doing the same thing. They move fast, they make a ton of money, they get all this power, and then they also uh, lie about how advanced the technology will be and how great it's going to help humanity, and then later the rest of the world is left to pick up the pieces. And with generative AI,
yeah,
that I do think it's a great technology. I think some of the things that you can do with it, like summarization, outlining, coding assistant, I think they're great. But the question is, why do we have to go zero to evil instantly? That's I think the real $1 million question.
yeah, yeah, and I think that as soon as the stability guy resigned today, there was offers from other ethical AI startups. They do exist, and also there's like a data market, like people actually licensing and making good training data sets for AI developers to use. And I think he'll have no problem finding his next employer. But the thing is that it's a cutthroat competition between these behemoths. Like they run their data centers into the ground. They run at a loss until nobody else can keep up. And if you compete against someone who pays nothing for their raw material, you're at a disadvantage from the get-go, right? It's really hard to compete on an unregulated in an unregulated space and be ethical. You need a legal system to back you up and to correct those imbalances, right? So it's really a race to the bottom dynamic between these tech behemoths, like competing internally. I really look forward to seeing these developments now, where we see international partnerships between states forming around, like, what's the code of conduct within the G7 countries, for instance. There's an agreement on some set of playing rules to adhere to, right? If you want to sell to all of the Americans your amazing new AI service, you have to abide by this and this and this. That, and it's coming along and it's moving. I mean, for being anything regulatory, it's developing really, really fast, I would say. But there's a long prehistory of kind of debating this and going back. I mean, a lot of people who are really into shaping the EU regulation, let's say, an EU AI Act and the TDM exceptions and the Digital Single Market Directive and all that. Some of those could easily see the trajectory to here, but most people, it's like we got blindsided by the development, right? It hit us like a truck from straight behind. For about a year ago, it suddenly went from being a fun toy to something that kind of could outcompete a lot of things, and add a lot of new value. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that the key issue for organizations, for developers, is something I call ethical weighting, where
Mm,
if you were let's say you were the IT leader in a company, or you're the CIO or something like that. I think most people have heard of the concept of vendor selection, right? Where you always have to get two bids or three bids for
mm,
like a piece of hardware. And what I find to be very shocking is that many organizations, they just hear a word, oh, ChatGPT, oh yeah, sure, let's go, right? And is that's not vendor selection, right? Is that
mm,
could be one of the ways that you could, in a very low stress and not a complicated way, start to look at the problem more deeply. So the topic that I think is an important topic is ethical weighting, which is, if you're a CIO of a company, you don't just buy the first server, right? You compare it, you get another bid. Similarly with Gen AI companies, at least even if you don't want to get deep into the issues, you should always compare a second company and look
mm,
at the structure. So, for example, in the case of OpenAI, there's a lot of concerns. Like, the leadership seems maybe not well perceived publicly. There's some lawsuits. It looks like they're pirating data. They publicly seem like they're okay with that. They say it's fair use. But then you have people that left OpenAI and created a competitor that has a public benefit structure. So it's not just hand waving, they have it. And they
mm.
also, if you ask, Anthropic, they explicitly say inside of the chatbot, we do not believe in pirating data. So there's actually a very clear difference. Now, maybe they're doing some things that I don't like in the future, so I'm not going to say they're perfect, but that would be a good example of saying, I can at least compare another option. So I think that's a very easy place for people to start.
Yeah, for sure. And if you look at Stanford, are doing the transparency index thing, right there, where they compare foundation model vendors. I know a dozen of them or so, on a dozen or so parameters, and it's things like data governance and data transparency and so on and so forth. So, and that's, as to my knowledge, started out as looking at how far are you ready for the probably coming AI Act in the EU, right? So they had all the parameters from there in terms of coming regulation potentially, and then they ranked them, and as if I recall correctly from this summer, the best of them was Bloom. They had they had like a two-thirds score. That was like the top of the line in terms of how well they scored. I've seen some criticism against their scoring methodology and so on, but at least there's someone doing that thing, right? So helping vendors, seeing at least, okay, so who are the players available and how do they stack up? And then you can sort of go and pick maybe the two or three that you. I mean, this is a lot of job in also in doing vendor selection, right? So, but at least you have the long list, and then you can do your short list, and then go from there. Then again, I mean, for Anthropic, they're backed by Amazon, right? So let's see where that goes.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I think this is the thing that's, uncomfortable about tech, is that, and this is why I came up with this concept of ethical weighting, is that you're gonna be looking for a long time to find purity, right? And it's there's so many problems with
Mm,
tech companies, that I think the only possible way you can solve the problem is
mm,
to always compare, right? And say
yeah, yeah.
that, look, I may not like this other company, but I'll call them neutral, right? Like,
Mm,
they're not great, but they're not bad,
yeah,
or they're at least moderate in terms of the good outweighs the bad and then neutralizes. But I think
yeah.
the only thing you can do is to
Mm.
try to do these comparisons.
Yeah, and there's some good frameworks like the AI ethics institutes, and also within the public purchasing, there are some good frameworks on how you might approach how to compare them. True cost accounting, for instance, is one of them. Like where you look at not only the business, you look at the market perspective, the societal perspective and the environmental perspective, and you at least map out what are your most like important concerns in each of those dimensions, and then you can kind of rank the companies in as far as they're transparent, like in as far as you can find out. So you start out with um, like what are our environmental and social goals? What's our code of conduct? What is the company want to be, and in how far do they match those things?
Well
Um,
well, yeah, and I would say, since I work with universities, I
mm,
know a lot of universities are actually starting to look into this. So
mm,
they're doing due diligence. They're saying, okay, we know we need to use generative AI. We want to help with students. We want to do this stuff. And my advice to universities has been to be very similar, which is, I think there's a higher bar, right, for nonprofits, universities, where you really do need to be careful, because if your brand is got a very good reputation, for example,
mm,
I mean, we can look at the classic example in the last several months, which is FTX, right?
mm,
If you look at someone who had an incredible reputation in the United States, which was Larry David, he was very funny, like a very funny, comedian, and he wrote Seinfeld.
mm,
He has an amazing show on HBO, but in fact, he now is co-branded with, I think, potentially the worst con artists in our generation, right? In terms of the value stolen and
mm,
embezzled from FTX, right? He's been convicted, right? So we can say that he's
mm.
a
Yeah, yeah,
convicted embezzler.
yeah.
And so, like, if you rush into a relationship, like for example with a generative AI company, and you haven't really done the due diligence, and then you're
Mm.
co-branded and you're on their website, there could be severe repercussions.
Yeah, for sure, it hurts your brand equity if you're a big company as well, right? And your public standing. So there's I mean, it's not just public institutions. Anyone needs to be cautious. And when I look at the kind of emerging guidelines for large corporations and how to approach, it's usually a lot about cyber risk and cybersecurity and those kind of an IP, but from the perspective of if we roll this out to our employees and they upload the wrong thing and it gets away, that seems to be the key concern. But I mean, any large company needs to do a comprehensive multidimensional due diligence before jumping into bed with a new vendor like this, and especially seeing as I mean, potentially it will be a very close collaboration, very business critical. If you roll out ChatGPT to all of your employees, they're kind of a trusted daily voice that you keep giving information all the time, right? They're really tied up closely into the communication and the information flows within your company. So you really need a trusted partner, both from having the staying power in the market, but also kind of in having all the processes and the legal side in order.
Well, yeah, I actually, it's a good point you bring up, and I've actually been giving some advice on this as well. Is that there actually could be uh, severe legal risk to using generative AI in cloud providers, because it tempts your employees into revealing sensitive information that could be
Mm,
illegal to distribute. So, for example, if you're at the university system in the United States, there's something called FERPA, if I remember correctly, where it's illegal to share student data, right?
mm,
You cannot do it. You cannot like, if I took a quiz from a student and I put it on a website, there's severe repercussions for that. So
mm,
likewise, if you're putting the student data into a system that is actually basically then later leaks,
mm,
or it's used in a way that is against the regulation, you're
mm,
actually introducing your university to a very big risk. Likewise with health, right? You're a hospital, and someone gets access to it because there's a license, and they start putting the health data in there. That could be illegal, right? There's regulations around that, and so this is actually opens up a kind of another area that we could talk about, which is that many corporations and nonprofits should potentially consider, if they are going to use generative AI, to think about ones that are local and open source and transparent. So that's
Right.
actually very different
Yeah.
than the commercial offerings, because if you wanted to analyze, let's say that you were writing a system that wanted to summarize all of the notes from a physician,
Mm,
you wanted to, create some kind of, annotation or whatever, it may be, again, it may be illegal to do this with a, depending on where you're at with a commercial tool. But if it was local, and actually you were able to look at the ethical sourcing of the data,
mm,
you're able to, maybe tune it a little bit. You actually could do something like that. And so
mm,
if you're going all in on a solution that is basically opening yourself up to litigation, that
mm.
also doesn't seem like a good strategy.
Right. No, and a lot of this isn't so much specific to AI, right? It's about your cloud strategy, basically. Where do I keep my stuff? Is it on-prem? Is it in a secure mountain room, or is it overseas? And how does it get overseas? And who gets to pry along the way and over there? And there was this huge scandal a couple of years ago where Microsoft were thrown out of the city of Stockholm because they couldn't kind of safeguard the personal information of the municipal employees. They were over in some cloud under the jurisdiction where they had no control, right? So I think generally people are very unaware where their data goes, and this technology, as you kind of allude to, it invites trust, right? It's a speaking partner, and it's very easy to slip in a way, and it's so convenient. Like, what if I upload this code snippet to get a quick rewrite, right? How bad could it be? Um, and and I think so. And there's also the aspect of there's not really much data points needed before you can identify someone, right? That's another aspect of this. It might not even be about the data you send. It might be about the pattern on how you send data. That might be the meta aspect that reveals the identity of someone, or some sensitive, like if you're a government employee working in some high security thing, just knowing your day-to-day patterns or your family situation, right, or your political affiliation. There's so many things that you can find out about a person that's compromising, right? And this is yet another way to casually, by accident, dropping the wrong data in the wrong place, right?
Yeah, I think that one thing that I've been saying to people over the last several years is that you need to have a divide by factor. So
Mhm.
if you look at some of the big names, like Elon Musk is a good one to pick on, where, for I think almost a decade he said self-driving cars will happen next year.
Oh yeah,
I
there's
think next year.
a great
I think next
supercut compilation on YouTube, right?
Yeah, yeah. So like, so that's a good example where I don't know what you would divide then everything he says by. 100 maybe? I mean, I think you have to pick, what the denominator is.
Mm.
Likewise, if we look at Airbnb, Uber, and I've talked to a lot of I know a lot of people that I've, casually had conversations. I won't say who they are, like very high level people that said, "Yeah, everything we said was not true." Right.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
well, stuff, yeah, like, yeah, it wasn't true. Turns out didn't work out. We created more pollution, right?
mm,
We created more traffic. All the things that we said that we were gonna do just didn't work out. And so then, yeah, what do you divide by? So they said this, divide. So likewise, we're yet again, or Airbnb, like it's causing homelessness globally, and it's directly linked, right? That's why cities are banning
mm,
Airbnbs, right? So now now we have generative AI tools, and what are they promising, right? Nirvana, AGI, all the stuff. Well, what do we divide by? I would say
yeah.
probably 100. I would say we
Yeah,
feel good
yeah,
about.
that's a good starting point, I think. And I mean, there was a betting pool among some AI, like the top people, and the scale is from AGI in 3 years to never, right? It's it's impossible to guess, even among the experts that disagree, right? And I think that what we really should question is why are we more concerned about future potentiality and future harm than actually looking at the real world impacts today, right? There's so much looking to the stars, so like, yeah, we'll go to Mars and whatever, but
Well, it's a good distraction to cover for the fact that you're doing illegal things.
yeah, you have your Skynet doomsday scenarios and your sentience claims and blah blah blah. It's really engaging. It's fun. It's interesting sci-fi stories, right? To but yeah, and I think like Jaron Lanier and a few others like him, there are some good voices out there that kind of point to this as well. Here's a priesthood. They claim to be the one true interpreter of the coming higher power or the present higher power, and we shouldn't question their decisions because they know what they're doing, right? Um, and yeah, it's a really a means of exercising power, like to stay above the fray and say, well, we're leave it to us. We understand this,
Yeah,
and
exactly. I agree with you.
consequences are very grave.
I mean, as someone who grew up in America and was exposed to a lot of religion in my
Mm,
life, that I think the easy thing to do to have power over people is to create these mystical things that
mm,
I can do to you if you
mm,
don't follow what I say, right? Like, the easy way to control someone is, well, if you don't do what I say, imagine the most horrible thing that could ever happen, and
yeah,
you'll be there forever. So do
yeah,
what I say, right? I mean, it's a pretty easy, right?
totally.
It,
Yeah, and I mean, and there's uh, this relation to technology at large, where you kind of it's really intimate to our daily lives, and we know all the bad shit we've done that ended up online, and they're kind of nagging at us like, oh, what if? And you tend to kind of clump together all of tech into a big blob. Like anything I might have put on the internet might come back to bite me if I kind of poke the bear. So I think yeah, nothing ever goes away, and it'll catch you eventually. So that they have that kind of leverage. And I think it was Emad Mustak of Stability who said that we can get behind your firewall or something like that. There's a famous tweet by him when they talk about the lack. I think it was about the lack of quality training data or something, and I said, well, we can always, if you're smart, you can get behind a firewall.
wow,
So there's this looming threat of, we're everywhere, we're in all of your devices. That's also there, right?
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think really, if the action items, which I think it's easy to complain about some of the technical stuff, but I think some of the action items would be that, you should it's irresponsible to not do a comparison when you use new technologies.
Mm,
Second, I think is also irresponsible to not do a divide by, right? Of course,
mm,
we need to embrace new things and new technologies. That's what I've done my entire life, but
yeah.
it's irresponsible to not have a divide by. And then also, it's important to look at the historical perspective of the United States. So I think the book by Thomas Piketty is a very good explanation of the last 100 years of America, where at one point America was doing pretty well, and Europe was, there's massive income inequality because there was royalty. But we've actually swapped now. The income inequality in America is worse than when people were basically serfs, living on the lands of the royals. And
Mm,
so I think you can't necessarily completely take that out of what's really going on, which is
yeah.
that there's actually a redistribution of wealth to the most elite, wealthy people in America. And so why wouldn't they do that globally as well, right? That's really the philosophy, is a what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's I think people are getting shortchanged over and over in terms of not understanding the true kind of value bargain going on. Like, oh, I get this shiny thing for free, and then you find out several years later you've given them all your data, and they probably spent way more hours of your life mindlessly scrolling or buying shit you don't need. Like, and people, we're kind of dumb. We're just monkeys, right? And uh, the, it's so easy to push the buttons, and we're kind of, I think it's Tristan Harris who says this thing about like we're in this chess game for our own attention against a million times stronger computer than that one that beat Kasparov, right? That's so we're on the losing end of our attention game like all the time. But also like with ChatGPT, it's a convenience, right? That's what gets us. It's so convenient to use the thing, so we start using it for more and more and more stuff and uploading more and more and more, and then turning a blind eye to what we lose in the process, right? Totally forgetting about the time spent and the data spent. Like for instance, we got the paywall for Facebook the other week. Like to you get so you're not allowed to profile EU citizens to the extent that they do to sell you personalized ads anymore. So what Facebook needs to, Meta needs to do is they need to offer you this bargain, like either you subscribe, like $12 a month or something, or you allow us to tailor ads by tracking personal data. Uh, and once that value bargain like that it rises to the surface, it becomes visible, right? It's a conscious choice. And had this roundtable in one of my data ethics classes, and which it was kind of an international group. And the Indians thought like, oh, that's a first world problem right there.
Yeah.
Actually, we don't have food on our table. So, but you white guys, you discussed that for a while, and you had the Polish guy who said, well, that's a crazy amount of money. I could never like that. I'm basically forced. I'm forced on board. And I like living in Sweden and working IT. I have the choice like from a monetary, but then again, it's like, well, this is the cost of Netflix for something I already got for free versus my dignity, like more or less. And I ended up just quitting Facebook overnight. That's where it ended up, right? But I think that's and that's the thing now, like the blitz scaling at a loss, like the part of the Y Combinator playbook is they give away their product for free to get us to market it and use it and adopt it and write books about how amazing it is, but they're running the whole thing at a loss, right? So the taxman cometh, right? Sooner or later it's going to cost you. And I think that it's really easy to sleepwalk at scale into a situation where you can no longer backpedal your way out, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you bring up, which is that is there going to be a reckoning with the cost of the inference, because GPU is very expensive.
Mhm.
You know, there's some speculation that actually it's a incredible loss of money, and so in order for them to really capitalize on it, first they have it's called vulture capitalism is another way people have
Mm,
said this, where you or predatory capitalism,
mm,
where you basically do predatory pricing, and you undercut the competition for a long time, and you're always at a loss, and then
yeah,
you just run them out of business,
yeah,
and then you just jack up the prices.
yeah,
So the reason why, if you look at some of the things that are happening with Microsoft, where like everything's Copilot now,
yeah,
like Chat GPT, everything everywhere, is that they may actually have to do this, because if they don't get enough users, they don't get enough scale,
yeah.
they may have actually lost a substantial amount of money, because GPU inference is just incredibly expensive.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
I
where did
saw the numbers pretty recently. Like Copilot, they charge you like $10 a month, I think, and depending on how much you use it, because it doesn't scale with usage, unlike Midjourney and some others. They charge you per GPU hour more or less, right? But Copilot doesn't. So depending on if you use it a lot or a little, it costs them between 30 and $80 to per month to deliver it to you. So they do run it at a loss. And that's how the big guys stay on top, right? And it's the same with Amazon. All the like in the startup scene, you talk about the kill zone. You don't enter anything adjacent to what Amazon or Microsoft do, right? Because they will just price you out. They will just run you in, like diapers.com is the classical example, I think, where somebody found it like the brilliant and not might not be the most unique idea in the world to sell diapers online, but still they found a niche and it worked out for them. And Amazon say, "Oh, nice profit margin. Let's destroy it," and they just ran it into the ground, right? Because they wouldn't sell to them. I think they got the offer, and then they might have gotten the offer again, right? So yeah, if you have a pile of cash, you can basically get your way, right? Just burn it.
I guess to maybe summarize, then the key issues here are that the tech companies have been doing really the same playbook for quite some time. There's lots of examples of it. This generative AI, uh, you know,
Mm,
claiming fair use when it's pretty obvious to even a 3-year-old that this is taking intellectual property that was created by really hardworking and vulnerable people and monetizing it without their permission. I think that's really the gist of the issue.
yeah, if you look at like the data licensing is a thing, right? You can buy data, and somehow that doesn't appear in AI PR. It's like, oh, it's a magical resource. It looks at it somehow, but there is a market, there is a price for data, right? For training data, and so there's not a business case if they have to pay. That's basically what Mark and Reason went out and says. We've spent billions. If we have to pay for the data as well, we don't have a business, more or less. And the way it works out with Stable Diffusion, it's now, I think they retired 2 of the models yesterday after having run them for a year. These are research models. They're not licensed for commercial use. Uh, but what happened is everyone built services on top and started selling the images out of Stable Diffusion over this year. Like, and that serves to dump the prices for their training data. That's the key resource that they can't afford. And if they flood the market with pirate material, and Adobe starts selling Stable Diffusion outputs, uh, that like that you can spit out 10,000 images of on the course of a day and start selling them, right? So they dump the prices for their key resource. That's really what they're doing. So they have a better bargaining position when they do start licensing data. That's my view, at least.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the coding space, there's a lot of also claims about how effective the tools are, and I think they're. I definitely have used Copilot quite a bit. I switched to Code Whisper from AWS, which
Mhm.
doesn't have the baggage of Copilot, and I think they're good. But I also don't think that it's like a slam dunk. And in fact, even Copilot, they'll admit that it's good for the low level, but at
Mm.
expert
Yeah.
level, it's diminishing returns. Like there's some use cases for it, but if you're an expert, there's less of a use case. So I think that's another kind of aspect of this as well, is that kind of these like I know people. I worked in film for years. I know a lot of people who are or artists, and their talent is amazing, right? They have
Mm.
deep talent that took decades to produce. What I see when I see something from generative AI, like a graphic, or some pictures that were generated, I don't really think this was a master that created this, right? This feels like really commodity,
It's generic, and
generic.
there are people who do amazing things. If you're an artist, you can make it express your personal voice. I do believe that, and there are examples, but I think most of the users have it as a lazy shortcut. And I think your example for code translates quite well to text and images as well. That this is a hyper shortcut to halfway, which is revolutionary if you're at the low end of the scale, and not so useful if you're at the higher end of the scale. Maybe it saves you some drudge work right now and then, so you can skip a few steps. But that also has downsides, right? There's the apprenticeship. What happens, like if all the junior tasks that you would use for practice, if you use the bot to do that instead, then there's an element of human learning that gets lost as well, right? And there's that, and there's also kind of, if we look at the value contract for the open source community, it's all based on kind of attribution is key, like building a name and for yourself, getting credit for the work you've done, even though you might not get the direct monetary reward, right? And also there's like social control. You can sort of know that this guy over here, he usually does this thing really well, so let's have that one and learn from it, right? And what all of these systems do is they cut off the head, they remove the attribution, right? And they round off the some rights reserved, which, I mean, Creative Commons and FOSS licensing, there's so many nuances. Like you can pick and choose what rights to reserve, right, by choosing another license. But they all have some rights reserved, and the way Copilot and all the others do it, they kind of round that down to none whatsoever. They strip away the human, and then they can strip away the rights, and they can still use the code.
Yeah, I think that is something that, so a few different things about that you just mentioned, I'll touch on. So because I teach new students how to
Mhm.
code, I have recommended they use generative AI to help them code. But one thing that I've found out is that it does seem like, as you mentioned, the apprenticeship part is missing because
Mm.
when I first teach someone how to code, I say you need to make 100 mistakes per week.
Yeah.
Right, that's your metric. If you're
Mhm.
not making 100 mistakes per week, you're not learning. So, when they use, generative AI tools, they're not making 100 mistakes per week.
Right.
So now actually, not that the generative AI is bad, it's that you are actually not learning it now, and so that's a real problem. So that is, I think, a deep issue that needs to be addressed. The second part we
Mm.
mentioned, which is, yeah, the stripping of the rights of code. So a lot of the code examples, I have hundreds of repos in GitHub. I've put Creative Commons non-commercial for
Mhm.
years. And the
Yeah.
reason I do that is that I don't want to create this really deep example for something and then someone just steals it, puts it into a video somewhere, and then makes money off of the thing that I created. Right? Like, I mean,
Essentially exactly what happened, right?
right? And so, I think that issue of not respecting the rights of the people on the GitHub platform, I think this is a very big mistake. And I've been
Yeah.
talking to some other competitors to GitHub, and they said, "Well, what are your complaints with GitHub?" I said, "Well, it's a loss of trust because
Yeah.
initially when GitHub was created, it was this almost like a utopia, like a commune where everyone's sharing ideas and sharing everything, and they're creating open source products. And but then if you just steal everything and
Yeah.
get rid of all the licensing, why could I ever trust you again?"
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's a real. I think this is a real doomsday scenario for companies like GitHub. Is that, did you just blow yourself up?
Yeah, and the same goes for ArtStation and a few other DeviantArt. They do have gotten themselves into a huge trust issue, and I think, like, everyone understands at some level there's no free lunch, right? They hosted my code for free. That's great, but the value you got from trading code on top was so great that you didn't think about it, and I think it was kind of implicit and assumed, same as with the social platforms, that there's a value contract here saying that if I keep posting stuff, I might not make a living, but I attract attention to the platform, right? I attract new customers, new users that eventually, by some freemium ladder, they will pay, even if they don't pay today. I also attract attention. They can sell for eyeballs, they can sell for ads, right? And you thought, well, okay, so that's the deal, right? I give and I get, and they get something, and it sucks that I don't get a cut on the ad sales, but I don't care, right? Twitter does you do get the cut, and it's still no money, but and then when you introduce generative AI into the picture, you change the value contract. It's a rug pull. This mutual interchange of learning and trading and sharing, that was thrown out. Now
But
it's like we took this and we sell it to you.
and the if you ever go to business school, the classic story they tell you is about game theory and all these different scenarios. And the one that's the most classic of all game theory is the is the commons, right? Where basically the tragedy of the commons is that, let's say you get 1,000 acres of grass, and then you let all of the ranchers, there's 6 ranchers,
Mm,
all graze on the grass for free. What's the first thing that happens is one rancher goes in and goes, wait a second, I don't trust everybody, so I'm just going to eat all the grass and kill all the grass.
yeah.
Right? So
Yeah,
that's the classic.
and I like to end this. It's the tragedy of the unmanaged commons, right? It's the unregulated commons that has
Yeah,
that problem. If the commons is regulated and
that's
there's
right.
formalized enforcement of the reciprocity, then so it's not inherent to the commons; it's inherent to a deregulated or unregulated commons, right? And that's the thing here. There's this silent, implicit value contract that's been ripped apart, but you can't really point to it and say, "Hey, that's what I signed up for," because it doesn't really say in your terms of use, right? It's sort of implicit, like everyone does it, and these are the terms, and then suddenly there aren't anymore, and you don't, and then what the only thing you have to refer back to is your fundamental rights, right? To property and liberty and privacy and so on. So that, yeah, it's a bad situation. But I think they messed with the wrong community. I mean, the open source community was one of the first class action lawsuits, and they're it's chugging along nicely, right? It's $9 billion in damages and a bunch of annons, if I recall correctly. It's not even any real names on the lawsuit, and they tried to throw it out because of that, and but the judge let it roll on, and I think it's going to discovery now. Yeah,
Hmm.
right.
Well, I think the things that I think are troubling for organizations that are using generative AI is that if a large corporation like Microsoft, GitHub are saying, "Don't worry, OpenAI, when you get sued, we'll
Mm,
protect you."
yeah,
That's not a great way to really advertise your business. That seems to be terrible, right? I mean, why would
yeah,
you start using a product where you have to actually be protected from a lawsuit? And then the
yeah,
second part of it, as I mentioned, the brand reputation, is that
yeah.
if there in discovery are emails that are smoking guns that say, basically the people in charge of the companies doing the generative AI knowingly said, let's do illegal things,
Mm,
and then you're using their products and you've co-branded with that, that's a very bad public relations hit for your
mm,
company.
mm. Yeah, I mean, the whole indemnity thing, like when they go out and say, "Hey, we'll cover your legal fees." That's not new or unique to generative AI. It was established practice within stock photography, for instance, like you had because it's a little bit tricky to navigate and you can misstep. So they said, well, as long as you abide by our rules, we'll make sure that in case of a slip up, it's on us, right? But what we've seen this year is every big tech company doing the same thing and saying, so they're basically admitting we have a data sourcing problem here. We have an intellectual property problem. And we're doing like the next well best thing to just pushing the liability downstream onto you, and we're saying it's on us, but you still saying this problem exists. It's a big thing, and it's a lot cheaper for them to do that than actually license the content, so that's why they do it, right? But it's marginally less worse than Midjourney that say, well, if you use this in a way that costs us money, then we'll come and get the money from you. It's your problem. That's their way of doing it, right? Yeah, it, basically what they're doing is saying these are the new rules. You own what the computer makes. The computer made it. It's yours now, and we have the money to back it up. That's what they're saying, right? So it's really coherent, I would say, like the philosophy of, well, the robot god mind here. It's the origin of this. Or so either you who prompted it, you made it, or the robot made it. The ones who actually wrote the code back there, sorry guys, you're not part of it. And that's on in every step of the way, right? Also in how they do their terms of service.
Well,
Uh,
I think this is where the data poisoning starts to become very interesting, because if that's really true, and you're then what happens is that there's now an incentive to create very sophisticated data poisoning systems that subtly corrupt the whole training process and essentially destroy the ability to ingest this. And then if
mm,
your company is saying that it didn't matter, nothing you created mattered, why are you telling me that I shouldn't data poison? Like for example, I actually asked Anthropic, the um, the chatbot, about data poisoning when it first came out, and it was very interesting because someone put some very detailed information about data poisoning in
mm,
there, and it said, "No, no, that's very unethical to do data poisoning." I said, "Wait, what if you broke into my house and stole a
mm,
hard drive and indexed it? That's still unethical." It's like,
yeah,
no, that's not. You broke into my house and
yeah,
you stole the hard drive. That's, you're unethical. You stole something, like, I think that's a very interesting uh
yeah.
dilemma.
There's you have all these obviously paid shills going out claiming to be, I don't know, tech philosophers or whatever, saying, "Oh well, this will usher in an era of abundance, so property rights are imaginary anyway." And but it's funny how it's always about the little guys' rights, right? It's never about OpenAI source code. That's not what they're
Yeah.
referring to. That's still a valid application of intellectual property, apparently. Right?
Yeah, what exactly what would happen if if the source code, the training methods, and the
Mm,
data were all leaked to
mm.
OpenAI? Do you think they would just say, "Oh, well, now it's fair use. Everybody can."
Yeah. No, it's very asymmetrical, the whole thing. It really is. Yeah. Well, we'll see how long they get away with it. I mean, sooner or later, reality catches up. There's over 150 lawsuits and regulatory probes and national bans and whatever. So it keeps mounting up. And that's, I think, even before the major book publishers and news publishers have gotten anything off the ground. They move more slowly. Uh, Maybe you saw New York Times last week, they pulled out of Common Crawl, so they took all of their old articles out of the original Big Mama web scraper that's used in all the search engines, right? Because again, the value contract flipped, right? It used to be good for discovery and good for search, and now it's being used to replace you. Then it's like, I don't even care about search. Just give me back my content, right? So
Well,
that, yeah.
yeah, and what's interesting about what could happen as well with search is that, you know, I could see a scenario where actually search goes away. If essentially the whole internet is in some model, why would you need to use a search engine anymore? Right? It's the
Yeah.
data's there, right? The links are there, and so that also, could be an interesting
Yeah.
surprise factor, is that this is what I suspect is going to happen, is that all profit will lead to zero,
Mm,
meaning that in perfect competition, basically there's no way to make money.
mm,
And as open source gets further and further along, it may be the case that actually there is no profit margin, there's
mm,
nothing, and
mm,
even it could destroy existing companies like Google, could just cease to exist. And so that's kind of a very interesting one I haven't heard a lot of people
mm,
talk about, but this is the doomsday scenario, is that
mm,
everything you invested into generative AI disappears because there's no profit.
mm,
Second, if you're a search engine, being Google, you also exist. So this was something that happened with Craigslist, right? When
mm.
Craigslist came out, they just destroyed multiple industries. And why? Because it was free. Same with Linux.
Yeah.
Linux destroyed actually Solaris server, which was a very high-end Unix server I used to use back in, late 90s, early 2000s, destroyed it. It's gone.
Mm,
Windows gone. Like, I mean, and so that's I think a scenario that people should at least be aware of is that this idea that like you're gonna, you know, use some paid commercial generative AI service and it's going to be disruptive, et cetera. Like, first of all, everybody's got access to it.
Yeah.
Second, there's ruthless competition
Mhm.
amongst many vendors and open source. It's possible in 5 years the entire thing just vanishes and some companies go out of business.
Yeah. But where will GPU cost be in 5 years, do you think? I mean, this
Well, I think what could happen is that the GPU is really maybe goes away because the GPU is accidentally used for machine learning. GPU is a graphics processing unit, and so
right.
there's really no reason we should be using it for
Mm,
deep learning. And really, the next generation of chips are specifically designed for doing both training and inference. So I
yeah,
think what's probably going to happen as well is that everybody's computers will have more and more specialized chips. Like Apple has some of this. Like if you go to the
yeah,
Apple iPhone, the
mm,
iPhone has these A chips inside of them
yeah, yeah.
here,
Mm,
and
mm,
it's a special chip
mm.
for doing inference. So I
Right,
think likely the short term GPU thing will just go away.
right. And really my point was about the inference, like there's rapidly dropping costs on the hardware side,
Yeah.
right? But there's some other costs that's not likely to go away. But I think we see radical drops in energy use and so on as well. So there, it might be the way I interpret it, how they're doing it now. It's a race for mind share and sticking, and then it's kind of hanging in there until the costs drop and the others drop out. But it's also about it's an infrastructure play, right? You want to stake your claim at the bottom of the stack, so the others have to build their stuff on top of yours. Um, and that's clearly outspoken by Emad Mustak, for instance. He says this is a pure infrastructure play. We give the foundation model away for free. We get an ecosystem of developers, and then we have our own stuff on top. That's how we roll. And we saw that last week with Altman doing the whole GPT thing on top of his model, right? So it's a renter model where everyone pays the guy who has the biggest dev share and user share and market share. Um,
Yeah,
so
I agree. I mean, I think that's how VCs think is they're really that's basically their only idea. You know,
mm,
I've actually worked with a lot of VCs in the Bay Area, and it's really not a lot of I would say deep thinkers. It's all about how do I actually become the middleman? That's
mm,
every single company is how do I actually add zero value and take things out of the transaction?
yeah, 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 and that's the middleman is not necessarily what the world needs more of, right? That it's the tech we're interested in. The LLMs are there's so many ways you can build a system, you can architect it without having everything going overseas to the guy who collects rent, right?
Well, and the what and that's why I'm saying in 5, 10 years, it's possible there's the everything vanishes in terms of profit. Here's a
Mm,
good example. If you look at the last 20 years of technology, you know, what would if you had to ask me what was one of the greatest technology inventions, it'd probably be something no one would say. I would say Wikipedia.
mm,
Wikipedia is one of the best things that has been invented in technology. It's
yeah,
mostly just good.
yeah,
It's a high quality source of information and it's free.
mm,
And it actually competes with things like, you know, commercial encyclopedias.
mm,
Why wouldn't Wikipedia get into the LLM game? Why wouldn't libraries get into the LLM game? Why wouldn't a lot of these public good companies start to develop things based on ethical source data? And what would that actually do to these for-profit companies? I really feel like this is what's happening with all VC products is they pump, 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 pump because you know you got to go IPO. Once you go IPO, good example of this is actually Terraform.
mhm,
Terraform is a infrastructure as a service company, and they got a lot of people hooked on their product because they said, "Well, we're cross cloud." So then they go IPO. Guess what happens? Well, first of all, people dump the stock, they get out, they make the money. So who cares? They won. And then the next thing they do is, by the way, it's not open source anymore. Actually, in all the stuff you produced, it's ours now. Right.
Yeah,
So like the is this going to be the same playbook? I mean,
yeah,
in the short term, I think companies are going to just pump, pump, pump. And even if you're an employee and you're using, let's say, OpenAI and you're at Microsoft or GitHub, I mean, you get RSUs. So
mm,
RSUs are worth actual money. So
mm,
potentially people are even being incentivized. Hey, here we go. Here's more stock. Here's more stock. Great, great. Let's get it. And like, what do you care, right? Like, if you can just dump, $500,000 worth of Microsoft stock and make some money off it, who cares if it even helps users?
mm.
If the company goes bankrupt, you made some money.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's the incentives are what they are, and then how it's used. That's so interesting as well. Like Andreessen going all in on the techno optimist thing, and so Andreessen is. I don't know how many other investors there are, but there's $5 million behind Civitai, and Civitai they commercialize a research model. They make money off top of a non-profit, a kind of allegedly non-profit stable diffusion model, uh, and they use their capital to do price competitions. They tell their users to go out and find good artists to copy the style from, and they have a bounty system for deep fake porn as well. So they kind of pay uh, users to go out and steal as much as they can, in terms of or breaching integrity and intellectual property, and they have some justification for why those rights don't exist or don't matter, and they like nominally they're DMCA compliant. Like they're saying we're a neutral platform. Whatever happens on here, that's between the users and whoever gets infringed. But they do sponsor them to do the thing and publish their models, right? Um, so I think it's interesting how the again back to the point that they're dumping the market for content online. They're kind of strip mining for content, like putting money behind taking property and laundering the rights away from it and publishing models on top of a research model.
Well,
Um,
and I think Andreessen is been on my radar for a bit because I listened to a podcast, a long form podcast with Sam Harris, where he was on there, and I was pretty disappointed actually with Sam Harris, who sometimes can give thoughtful podcasts, and and he didn't really challenge Andreessen anything he said. And one of the things that Andreessen said was the reason that I got a degree in computer science was I just wanted to make money. And I was like,
yeah,
wow, well, at least he's honest, is that
yeah,
that's what his only value in the world is, making money. And then, I think the thing that you hear him really lacking clarity on is when you mention any kind of a negative externality, and I think it might have even come up in the podcast, just silence, nothing. Then the answer is like, I just don't care, right? Like I don't care. And
uh,
I think that's really the if you get down to it, if you look at things like crypto,
mm,
there's no business use case other than laundering money to North Korea
mm,
or Iran or terrorists, right? That's the business model, right? I mean,
mm,
is
mm,
providing a way that people that are under sanctions or criminals, cartels can actually give money to each other.
mm,
Obviously, it kills the environment as well. And then
mm,
these major VCs are backing platforms like this. And
yeah,
so is it any surprise that we're seeing the same kind of behavior with generative AI?
no. No, I mean, yeah, it's a tragedy. Really, it is. What to say? What to say? It's a sad note to end on. I feel like we're approaching the end of the
Yeah,
conversation. So
yeah,
like just uh, yeah, it's a sad state of the
yeah. Well, I think that is a great place to end on. It's that we're
yeah,
we're in some trouble.
yeah, and it's
So
going to get worse.
yeah, and I think it could. So,
Yeah,
maybe a good thing for you to do, because you're going to be introduced to, I think, a new audience, is you have a lot of thoughts on this topic. Do you
yeah,
want to tell people how to follow some of your thoughts and where to get a hold
sure.
of you?
Yeah, so I do my angry old man routine on LinkedIn regularly. I got my first notice for having like be used the wrong language today. I probably owe someone an apology. And I got thrown out of all the AI art groups and all the social medias by now. So, but well, I do some long form thinking on Substack as well. I try to post every week, kind of a wrap up of the latest things and my thoughts on that. So LinkedIn and Substack, look me up by name, Johan CB. So Johan CB, I dropped the B in it, but you have it on your screen now.
Cool.
Yeah, that's it. And yeah, do reach out, and I like to discuss the pros and cons, and I'm very tired of some of the pro AI talking points by now, and I try to kind of debunk them wholesale at times on my blog. So if you feel like you've answered the same pro AI talking point the millionth time, go visit my blog and find the copy paste
Yeah.
response.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in AI. I wrote a book called Pragmatic AI. Like, I'm
Yeah,
into AI. I teach AI, but I
yeah.
think your opinion is very well framed, and I think it's worth considering.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me again. It was a lot of fun. Uh,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.